nothing to fix, nothing to become. Most of us have lived for years with a quiet assumption that something about us needs correcting, not in an obvious, dramatic way, just a low hum in the background, a sense that who we are right now is not quite right, not quite ready, not quite enough. And from that feeling, a project begins. We call it growth, we call it practice, we call it the spiritual path. But underneath many of those names is something that feels more like repair work. There is a well-known teaching from the Buddha's own awakening. On the night he became free, he did not say he had reached enlightenment. He said something stranger. He said he had found the builder, the one who had been constructing the house of suffering all along. And he said, "You will build no more." Not, "I have finally become who I was meant to be." Not, "I have fixed everything that was wrong." But, "The builder has been seen." That is a very different kind of freedom. And it raises a question worth sitting with before this video goes any further. What if the search for freedom has not been moving you toward peace, but has been quietly deepening the sense that something is wrong? If that question lands anywhere close to your own experience, stay with it, because what we're exploring today goes to the very root of how suffering sustains itself. Part 1: Nothing to fix. Most people believe suffering comes from unpleasant experiences, from pain, from loss, from difficulty. But if we observe carefully, we begin to notice something unexpected. Very often, suffering does not come from the experience itself. It comes from the resistance to the experience. Something arises, and immediately, before we have even fully felt it, another movement begins. This should not be happening. I need to stop this. I need to get somewhere else. Notice how automatic that is. A sensation appears. The mind immediately wants it gone. Fear arises. The mind begins searching for escape. Sadness arises. The mind wants a different emotion. And here is what most people miss. The experience was one thing. The refusal of the experience is another. And that refusal, that second movement, is usually where the real suffering lies. Consider what happens with anger. When anger arises, there is already some discomfort. But then a second layer arrives. I should not feel this. A spiritual person would not feel this. I need to get rid of it. Now the suffering has multiplied. Not because anger grew stronger, but because resistance was added on top of it. The same is true of anxiety. Many people are not simply anxious. They become anxious about being anxious, frustrated about being anxious, ashamed about being anxious. One experience becomes 5. Not because reality created all 5, but because resistance did. This is one of the most important things to understand about suffering. The mind believes that resistance will remove the problem. But very often, resistance feeds the thing it is trying to fight. Imagine a person who has fallen into quicksand. Every instinct says, struggle, push, fight your way out. But every violent movement pulls them deeper. The effort to escape becomes part of the trap. Human suffering works in much the same way. The harder we fight certain inner experiences, the more energy and solidity we give them. This is why some people spend years trying to eliminate suffering, only to discover that suffering has become more complicated, not less. Because they never question the struggle itself. They only change the object of struggle. The Buddha pointed towards something completely different. He did not teach suppression. He did not teach indulgence. He taught direct seeing. Not, how do I get rid of this? But what is this? The ordinary mind wants escape. Seeing wants to understand. And this changes the relationship entirely. The experience may still be present. The fear, the sadness, the confusion, none of that disappears immediately. But now there is observation where there was conflict, understanding where there was struggle. And when that shift happens, something becomes clear. Reality was not the enemy. The demand that reality be different from what it already is, that was the enemy. But this understanding leads to a deeper question. If resistance creates one form of suffering, what about the endless project of becoming something else? What about the search for a better version of yourself? Because that may be where the suffering goes deepest. Part 2, Nothing to Become. Here is something worth observing directly. Has becoming ever actually ended? Think carefully. Every time the mind reaches one destination, it creates another. Graduate, now build a career. Build a career, now become financially secure. Become secure, now find meaning. Find meaning, now become enlightened. The object changes. The movement stays exactly the same. Always reaching, always one step away. The horizon keeps moving. Not because there is something wrong with you, but because the horizon was never a real destination. It only appeared reachable from a distance. The imagined future self works the same way. A calmer self, a wiser self, a more awakened self. We spend years trying to become that image. But notice something subtle here. The future self only exists as a thought. You have never met your future self. You have only imagined it. And yet, enormous portions of actual life are spent in service of that imagined character. This becomes especially visible in spiritual practice. Because the ego that once wanted status now wants enlightenment. The ego that once wanted wealth now wants awakening. The clothing changes. The movement does not. A person sits in meditation, outwardly still, but inwardly already bargaining. I hope I make progress. I hope I get somewhere. The body is here. The mind is already chasing tomorrow. A Vietnamese meditation master once pointed this out with unusual directness. The desire for enlightenment can become an obstacle to enlightenment. Not because enlightenment is wrong, but because craving is still craving. Whether the object of craving is money, approval, peace, or awakening. The movement is the same. Away from what is, toward what the mind imagines should be. And every time that movement begins, something important happens. The present moment is left behind. The only place where anything can actually be seen. The only place where reality is actually happening. This is not an argument against learning or practice. A path is still needed. But the purpose of genuine practice is not becoming. It is seeing. Seeing what is already true. Seeing what is already happening. Seeing what has been present all along, beneath the noise of the becoming project. And that brings us directly to the one who is running that project. Because if you observe carefully, you will find something very interesting. There is always a builder. Part 3, The Builder. There is an image from the night of the Buddha's awakening. On the night he became free, he addressed something he called the house builder. The one who had been constructing the house of suffering, thought by thought, expectation by expectation, brick by brick. Most people spend their lives examining the house. The problems, the emotions, the difficult relationships, the circumstances that seem to keep repeating. But rarely do they turn attention to the one who keeps building. The builder works quietly. It appears whenever reality fails to match expectation, whenever life refuses to follow the script, whenever a situation challenges the image we carry about who we are. And it speaks in a very recognizable voice. I should be different. I should be further along. I should not feel this. I should already know. I should already be peaceful. Notice how often the word should appears in inner life. That single word has built entire prisons. Because every should creates a gap between reality and imagination. And then the mind spends its energy trying to close that gap. This is why many people remain exhausted after years of practice. They are not simply practicing. They are building a spiritual identity, building an image of enlightenment, building an image of progress, and then suffering whenever reality fails to match the blueprint. The tragedy is not that the builder exists. The tragedy is that we mistake the builder for ourselves. We assume every thought belongs to us. Every judgment belongs to us. Every image of who we should be belongs to us. And so we spend our lives defending structures that were never stable to begin with. The first movement of wisdom is not destroying the builder. It is seeing the builder clearly, without adding another layer of judgment on top of it. Because what is seen directly, without resistance, without the urge to fix, begins to lose the grip it had when it was invisible. What is unconscious drives us. What is clearly seen no longer needs to. This is not a method. It is not a technique. It is simply what happens when attention finally turns toward what is actually happening, rather than toward what should be happening instead. And this leads to perhaps the most surprising obstacle of all. Because the builder's most effective tool is not desire or fear. It is knowledge. Part 4: The obstacle of knowing. One of the most subtle barriers on this path is not ignorance in the ordinary sense. It is accumulated knowing. At first that sounds strange. Is knowledge not necessary? Of course it is. Knowledge has its proper place. But the obstacle appears when knowledge begins to replace direct seeing. When second-hand understanding stands in for first-hand experience. A person can spend 10 years studying mindfulness and still not know what it means to be fully present for a single breath. A person can explain the nature of awareness with precision and remain completely unaware of the resistance running in their own body right now. A person can discuss the teachings on selflessness for hours and never actually look for the self they are discussing. Knowledge is easy to collect. Seeing is rare. This is not a criticism of study. It is an observation about where people tend to stop. They collect descriptions of truth, descriptions of freedom, descriptions of what awakening is supposed to feel like, and then slowly begin mistaking those descriptions for the thing itself. The map for the territory, the menu for the meal. A meditation master once put it this way: the deeper problem is not that we do not know. The deeper problem is that we do not know, and yet we want. We do not fully know reality, yet we want reality to obey us. We do not know ourselves clearly, Yet we constantly work to improve what we have not yet understood. This movement, wanting without first seeing, is the engine of confusion. Because wanting always projects forward. Seeing simply stays here. Wanting says, it should be different. Seeing says, it is this. And once that gap becomes visible, the collecting begins to slow. Not because knowledge is wrong, but because something more direct becomes available. Something that does not need to be collected, only attended to. If you have spent time in this space before, not just thinking about practice, but actually sitting with your own experience, you may have already begun to sense what this points toward. If so, leave a note in the comments. Not about what you understood, but about what you actually noticed. That kind of honest observation is closer to practice than any amount of accumulated knowledge. Part 5. Returning to awareness. This is where people often become uncomfortable. Because the mind immediately asks, if I stop fixing myself, won't I become passive? If I stop trying to become better, won't I fall behind? These questions seem reasonable. But notice what they assume. They assume the only alternative to striving is laziness. The only alternative to becoming is passivity. But life itself does not work that way. The heart beats without striving. The lungs breathe without striving. A seed grows according to its nature, not according to its ambition. The problem is not action. The problem is interference. The mind constantly trying to improve what it has not yet understood. A Vietnamese meditation master described practice in a remarkably plain way. When there is something to do, be careful, be attentive, observe. When there is nothing to do, return, be whole, remain aware. Notice the simplicity. No promise of becoming extraordinary. No superior version of yourself waiting at the end. Only awareness. Only honest observation. Only direct participation in whatever is actually happening. The mind is looking for techniques. Reality is asking for attention. The mind is looking for a destination. Reality is only ever here. In this sound, in this breath, in this sensation, in this moment. Nothing needs to be added. Nothing needs to be removed. Reality is already revealing itself. The only question is whether we are available to see it. Because awareness is not something we create. It is what remains when interference subsides, when resistance softens, when becoming comes to rest, like the surface of a lake becoming still. The moon was always reflected there. The water only needed to stop moving. Conclusion: returning phenomena to phenomena. Perhaps the deepest misunderstanding in spiritual life is the belief that freedom is something we acquire, something we earn, something we finally arrive at. But what if freedom is not an acquisition? What if it is the absence of an unnecessary burden? What if wisdom is not addition, but subtraction? Not accumulation, but release. Most of our lives are spent collecting experiences, identities, achievements, knowledge, spiritual accomplishments. And yet the path the Buddha described moves in the opposite direction. A path of simplification. A path of letting the unnecessary fall away. Until gradually, one by one, the burdens become visible. The burden of resistance. The burden of becoming. The burden of accumulated knowing. The burden of an image we have built about who we are. And finally, the burden of the one carrying all of those burdens. What remains is astonishingly ordinary. This breath, this moment, this awareness, this life as it already is. Not perfected, not transformed into something else. Simply seen, clearly, directly, without interference, without argument, without becoming. There is a phrase that points directly to this. Returning the Dharma to the Dharma. Allowing reality to be what it is. No longer trying to improve existence before understanding it. No longer trying to become someone before knowing who is actually here. No longer trying to arrive somewhere other than where we already stand. Because reality was never the problem. This moment was never the problem. Life itself was never the problem. The struggle against life was the problem. The assumption that something essential was missing was the problem. And when that assumption finally loosens its grip, something profoundly simple becomes available. Not dramatic, not extraordinary. Just clear. Nothing to fix. Nothing to become. Only seeing. Only this. And perhaps for the first time. That is enough. If something in this touched a place you recognize in your own practice or in the quieter moments of your life, share it with someone who might need to hear it. Or leave your reflection below. Not as a conclusion, but as a beginning.